Welcome back to the second part of the morning agenda of Smart Recovery's 20th anniversary here in Washington, D.C. at the beautiful National Geographic Society headquarters. My name is Ashley Phillips, and I am a Smart face-to-face facilitator, and online I am known as AEP Tennis Lover. And hello to all of you out there in streaming land. SMART is a place where we will never ask that you declare yourself as powerless over alcohol and addictive behavior or any other unhelpful habit. We will never ask that you call yourself by a name. We believe that labels are better for jars than they are for people. If you are deeply religious or spiritual, you are welcome in our SMART community. If you are atheist or agnostic, we welcome you into SMART. And if you are still figuring that part out, you are welcome at SMART. We invite you to join us in creating and sustaining and nurturing a life that is consistent with your values and with your goals for yourself, as together we embrace and discover the power of choice. I am pleased to introduce to you William White. William White is an emeritus senior research consultant at Chestnut Health Systems, Lighthouse Institute, and is the past chair of the board of Recovery Communities United. Bill has a master's degree in addiction studies and has worked full-time in the addictions field since 1969 as a street worker, counselor, clinical director, researcher, well-traveled trainer, and consultant. He has authored and co-authored more than 400 articles and monographs. I'm sure many of you are familiar with his work. He inspired me to become a professional recovery coach. He has written research reports, book chapters, and over 17 books. His book, Slaying the Dragon, The History of Addiction Treatment and Recovery in America, received the prestigious McGovern Family Foundation Award for the best book on addiction recovery. Bill was featured on the Bill Moyers PBS special, Close to Home, Addiction in America, and Showtime's documentary, Smoking, Drinking, and Drugging in the 20th Century. Bill's sustained contributions to the field have been acknowledged by awards from the National Association of Addiction Treatment Providers, the National Council on Alcohol and Drug Dependence, NADAC, the Association of Addiction Professionals, the American Society of Addiction Medicine, and the Native American Wellbriety Movement. Bill's widely read papers on recovery advocacy have been published by the Johnston Institute in a book entitled, Let's Go Make Some History, Chronicles of the New Addiction Recovery Advocacy Movement. Let's hear from William White.
It's a pleasure to be with you for this 20th anniversary celebration of Smart Recovery. I'm going to be speaking to you today primarily as a recovery historian. I've been asked to review the history of recovery in the United States, and in particular, the role of Smart Recovery within that history. If we look at the history of recovery in the United States, it's actually a very rich history dating all the way into the 1730s with the rise of abstinence-based cultural and religious revitalization movements within Native American tribes. These were really the first recovery mutual aid societies in the United States, founded by individuals who, following their own struggles with alcoholism, reached out and began to bring and organize recovery circles within their various tribal communities. And we see that through the Handsome Lake movement of the late 1700s, the Kickapoo Prophet, the Shawnee Prophet movements, all the way through that history continues in Native communities, all the way through today's Wellbriety movement. In Euro-American communities, we saw the rise of alcohol and drug problems, particularly alcohol problems, as per capita alcohol consumption almost quadrupled between 1780 and 1830. And behind the rise of that consumption and the rise of related problems, we saw the emergence of people with serious alcohol dependence problems reaching to the temperance movement of that era to find a sobriety-based support structure. And then in 1840, we got perhaps the most significant of those movements with the Washingtonian movement, founded by 6 men in a tavern in Baltimore, Maryland, in the spring of 1840, who decided they needed to start their own temperance movement, but only for hard cases, men, very hard drinking men like themselves. So they founded the Washingtonian Temperance Society that grew from those 6 men to more than 400,000 individuals by the end of the 1840s. And then almost overnight disintegrated for a whole variety of issues. And many of the alcoholics in that movement went underground and began to organize fraternal temperance societies that were very recovery focused. But again, once established, many of those became quite elitist in their orientation. I have materials from this area where some of the societies reported that they only wanted drunkards of good repute to be part of their organizations. And as those cliques of recovery grew smaller and smaller, we again begin to get the rise of alternative recovery mutual aid structures. And this was particularly in the 1870s, the ribbon reform movement. Now, during this same era, we also had recovery mutual aid organizations birthed within treatment organizations, the inebriate homes, the inebriate asylums, the private addiction cure institutes of the late 1800s. These are organizations like the Keeley Leagues, perhaps the largest of these groups, with more than 30,000 members scattered across the United States. We had the Alapod Club, the Godwin Association, the Dashaways. And this is all a way of saying that we have a very large number of recovery mutual aid societies from the late 1700s through the 1800s. By the late 1800s, with the growth of the American temperance movement, we had a dramatic shift in American policy. And that policy, as people became increasingly disillusioned about recovery and the growing visibility of alcohol problems in local communities and the rise of other drug problems, there was a kind of growing sentiment, a kind of growing pessimism. And in essence, what the country said was, let's let the existing alcoholics and addicts die off. And in fact, the sooner the better. And we're going to prevent a new generation of alcoholics and addicts by legally prohibiting the sale of alcohol and aggressively controlling the distribution of opium, morphine, cocaine, and other psychoactive medications. And that's precisely what happened. And it was in that growing drive for temperance in the opening 2 decades of the 20th century that we get the virtual disintegration of 19th century recovery mutual aid organizations and the early American treatment institutions. Now, during this vacuum in which large number of alcoholics were relegated to the back wards of aging state psychiatric hospitals, penal inebriate colonies, a period where laws were passed in many states mandating the sterilization of alcohol and drug dependent men and women, a pretty horrific time period. We also began to see some what we call transition groups. And the transition groups were, for example, in the city of Boston, there was a movement to develop lay alcoholism therapists, treating alcoholics and then training them in a particular technique of alcoholism counseling. And that particular outpatient clinic model also involved a social club called the Jacoby Club. And the Jacoby Club became one of these mutual aid alternatives closely linked with addiction treatment at the time. Now, we also have during this period some interesting groups, the United Order of Ex-Boozers, the Drunkards Club. And my point with referencing these is to simply say that history tells us that when options for recovery become restricted or get collapsed, out of the ashes of that disintegration will rise new recovery mutual aid alternatives. And we'll see that also through the 20th century. We move now to the mid-20th century with the founding of Alcoholics Anonymous in 1935. We move to then adaptations of Alcoholics Anonymous for drugs other than alcohol, the rise of Addicts Anonymous in 1947, Narcotics Anonymous between 1950 and 1953, and then of course the multiple adaptations of the 12 steps of AA for drugs other than alcohol. And from the period of about from the 40s through the 50s and 60s, these 12-step programs are going to be pretty much the dominant, if not sole, mutual aid recovery alternatives. But we are going to begin to see the development of alternatives. The religious alternatives to 12-step programs begins with Alcoholic Victorious in 1948, extends through a number of faith-based recovery mutual aid alternatives, including Mountain Movers, including Alcoholics for Christ, all the way through the more recent founding of Celebrate Recovery, which may in fact now be one of the fastest growing recovery mutual aid structures in the United States. And then if we look on secular alternatives for recovery, these really begin in 1975 with the founding of Women for Sobriety by Dr. Jeane Kirkpatrick. And then we move a decade later and we see the rise of Rational Recovery, Secular Organization for Sobriety, and then into the 1990s, we begin to get the emergence of other secular alternatives, including Moderation Management, Smart Recovery in 1994, and later in that decade, we get LifeRing Secular Recovery. Now, all of this is a way just to illustrate what has become a growing principle within the recovery advocacy movement nationally. And that sort of core idea is that there are multiple pathways of long-term addiction recovery and that all are cause for celebration. So with this brief history, we see the evolution of both secular, religious, and spiritual recovery mutual aid societies with a growing complex relationship between those groups and professionally directed addiction treatment in the United States. Now, if someone were to ask me, what is the distinctiveness, what distinctive role does Smart Recovery play within this history? I would suggest a number of things, and I'll mention at least a few of those in this brief time that I have. The first of those is Smart Recovery is one of the first recovery mutual aid organizations that tried to integrate two very different ways of knowing, and that is experiential knowledge that really came out of the personal experience and family experience of addiction and recovery, with a separate and distinct body of scientific knowledge. And historically, almost all of the recovery mutual aid organizations relied exclusively on experiential knowledge. Smart Recovery's efforts to integrate scientific knowledge with experiential knowledge does have a significant role within the history of recovery in the United States. To include the fact that with the growing number of medications emerging and in development for the treatment of alcohol and drug dependence, Smart Recovery becomes one of the few recovery mutual aid organizations that explicitly defines itself in a kind of medication-friendly manner. Now, also with that integration of experiential and professional knowledge, we also get with Smart Recovery a sort of hybrid model that's very different from traditional recovery mutual aid organizations, in that in its leadership of meetings, both online and face-to-face meetings, we get an integration of both peer leadership and professional leadership. And we don't see that combination, we rarely see that combination within the history of recovery mutual aid organizations. I think a third area that we would see that's somewhat distinctive is simply the size and growing accessibility of Smart Recovery within the history of secular recovery in the United States. Having reached the 1,000 meeting milestone this past year means that Smart Recovery represents the largest and most geographically accessible of the secular recovery mutual aid societies. I think a fourth area of some distinction is the growing relationship between Smart Recovery and professionally directed addiction treatment in the United States. At present, about 20% of Smart Recovery members identify that they got to Smart Recovery via referral or linkage from professionally directed treatment. I know significant efforts have been exhausted within Smart Recovery to bring Smart Recovery as an option for people undergoing addiction treatment in the United States. To have reached that 20% milestone is extremely significant, considering that Alcoholics Anonymous at present, their membership surveys reveal only about 32% of their members are currently entering AA through the vehicle of referral to treatment. So to have bridged that gap and move Smart Recovery so close to AA really says that Smart Recovery's done a remarkable job beginning to build its credibility with addiction professionals in the United States. Now, having identified some of these distinctive features doesn't mean that Smart Recovery, at least in my view, won't face some significant challenges and opportunities in these coming decades. I think the first challenge of any recovery mutual aid society is to outlive its founding generation. And Smart Recovery is still in that founding generation era. So one of the major challenges in the coming decades is the question of how do you deal with the issue of leadership succession within Smart Recovery, both nationally and also locally, particularly within the face-to-face meeting structures, but also the leaders that have been pioneers with the online recovery support groups. I think a second question is really the viability of the hybrid model long term. And I suspect that this is going to be a unique contribution that Smart Recovery will make to the addiction recovery field. But there will be tensions between, on the one hand, wanting to pull that model or pressures or drift towards an even more professionalized model of care and support versus equal pressures to pull that towards a more purely peer-based recovery support model. So it's going to be very interesting to follow the history of Smart Recovery to see sort of how that hybrid model evolves over time. I think the other major challenges for the next couple of decades are going to include defining the limits of mutual identification within Smart Recovery and the boundaries of Smart Recovery's effectiveness. I think this is going to come around the application of Smart Recovery to drugs other than alcohol, and in particular, the extent to which Smart Recovery is going to be relevant in the current opioid epidemic in the United States, or not relevant, and that's a question that I think is going to have to be tested. At the same time, there's going to be the issue of the ability to test the applicability of Smart Recovery for problems other than alcohol and drug specific problems. And I'm talking specifically here the extent to which Smart Recovery will be adapted to address process addictions and larger problems of living to which Smart Recovery may be adapted. I think we're going to see the era of replication of Smart for other problems of living that parallel the kind of adaptations we saw with 12-step programs through the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I think a related strain or challenge, but also enormous opportunity, is the extent to which Smart Recovery is going to be able to adapt to diverse cultural settings and different populations of individuals. Right now, Smart Recovery is overwhelmingly white, it is overwhelmingly affluent and educated. So the question becomes, to what extent will Smart Recovery become a viable option for communities of color in the United States, and in particular poor communities of color? To what extent will Smart Recovery be able to deal with individuals with much lower levels of education, given that Smart Recovery provides such a clear cognitive map for the recovery process? So I think those are going to be challenges to Smart, to define its limitations, but also to say, are there parts of Smart Recovery that can be refined and adapted for larger utility as Smart Recovery becomes a more significant part of the recovery culture and the larger culture of the United States. Finally, I think there's a growing recovery movement in the United States. And I think there's going to be an enormous opportunity for smart recovery to play a role within that culture, within that advocacy movement and recovery support movement. Let me mention at least what that is. We're beginning to see recovery emerge as a new organizing paradigm in addiction treatment. We know a lot about addiction, we know a lot about professional treatment, but we know very little from the standpoint of science about the long-term process of addiction recovery. And what is emerging is a challenge by people in recovery to say, you've documented our pathology, you've documented how we've become stabilized. Now it's time to draw from us the lessons of our lived experience in long-term recovery and let that information and lessons out of our lives inform addiction treatment and alcohol and drug policy in the United States. We're seeing the rise of new recovery support institutions. We're seeing recovery residences grow at an exponential rate. We're seeing recovery schools and recovery industries and recovery ministries and recovery cafes and recovery-focused venues in sports and the arts and on and on and on. And we're seeing the rise of virtual recovery in the United States, an elaborate online recovery community that is individuals initiating and sustaining recovery and enhancing their quality of life without having participated in face-to-face recovery support meetings. We're seeing and have seen since the 2001 Recovery Summit in St. Paul, Minnesota, the rise of a new recovery advocacy movement in the United States, a vanguard of recovering people who are stepping forward to announce their presence in this culture on the grounds that addiction is ever present and overwhelmingly visible in the United States. But recovery until very recently has been all but invisible. And what that vanguard is doing is challenging people in recovery whose personal circumstances allow and who are temperamentally suited to that role to step forward and announce their presence in this culture and begin to promote pro-recovery policies at federal, state, and local levels. One of the central ideas in that movement, as I referenced, is the idea that there are multiple pathways of recovery and all are cause for celebration. What this does is it provides an opportunity for smart recovery to become a significant influence within this movement and to have members of smart recovery march in celebration alongside AA and NA and WFS and LSR and SOS and on members, not as individuals representing those distinct fellowships, but becoming part of a larger recovery community with shared needs and shared interests and shared aspirations. So my point is here, I believe that smart recovery will serve itself very well to have a core of its members who choose to step forward and become part of this larger recovery advocacy movement. In conclusion, what I've tried to do is give you a feel of this incredible, wonderful, growing varieties of recovery experience in the United States, highlight smart recovery and its potentially significant role within that history. I believe smart recovery has a very important role to play in the future of addiction recovery in the United States. And unbeknownst to some of you, you may not be aware of it, but your personal destinies may be to play a significant role in the future of recovery in the United States through these various movements I have described. I wish Smart Recovery and each of you the very best on your journey into that future. And thank you again for allowing me to be part of this 20th anniversary celebration.